In the shadows of the streets of 18th century London, there lived a notorious barber. He lured customers into his barber shop, slit their throats, and through a mechanism under his chair, dumped the bodies into the basement. Then his accomplice, Mrs. Lovett, used the flesh of these corpses as meat filling, stuffing them into the pies sold in her shop. Was this a real serial killer, or a fictional character born of folklore? Hello everyone, this is Fully Documented. Today, let's talk about the full story of this case. Sweeney Todd's real name was Benjamin Barker. He was born on October 26, 1756, in Stepney. That was in London, England, a dark area within the slums where poverty and disease ran rampant. His mother was a young silk worker. After a difficult birth at age 20, she could no longer bear children. His father was a weaver who, like many of his peers, gradually succumbed to alcohol. The family was destitute, and the house was always filled with drunken arguments. Young Benjamin often witnessed violence, and even suffered beatings himself. Whenever he couldn't stand his parents fighting, Benjamin would hide within the grim walls of the Tower of London to seek refuge. For a boy from the slums, this place became his peculiar school, often adding a touch of melodrama. To most people, this was merely a thrilling pastime, but Benjamin interpreted these accounts in a different way. He studied the machinery carefully, memorizing how they operated and what kind of wounds they caused. It was perhaps then that the initial concepts of the terrifying devices later used in his shop began to take root in his mind. In the winter of 1768, when Benjamin was 12 years old, London was hit by a severe cold snap. Coal became a luxury. His parents lost their jobs during this terrible period and spent their last penny amidst hunger and cold. One morning, Benjamin found that his parents had vanished. It is likely they froze to death on the streets or died in some alcohol-induced chaos. Their bodies, like hundreds of others from the lower class, were likely tossed into a mass grave for paupers. Shortly after, Benjamin became an apprentice to John the Cutler, where he learned to sharpen blades and craft tools. But in 1770, at age 14, he was arrested for petty theft and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The prison was a grim building with damp cells, where young thieves and hardened murderers were incarcerated together. While there, Benjamin met an elderly prison barber. The barber took young Benjamin as his assistant, marking a turning point in his life. In 1775, after leaving prison, Benjamin changed his name to Sweeney Todd. Those 5 years of prison life had transformed him into a cold and ruthless 19-year-old youth, while also giving him the mastery of the barber's trade. Initially, he worked as an itinerant barber, serving people on the streets and in markets who needed a shave. Barbers who wandered the streets were known as flying barbers. In order to secure a good spot in the trade, he often had to fight others, wielding his fists and his razor more than once. By 1780, he had saved enough money to open his own barbershop near Hyde Park Corner. Life seemed to be improving, but everything changed on the fatal night of December 1st, 1784. A drunken customer boasted about spending time with a charming girl on Hamilton Street the night before. Todd suspected the customer was talking about his own woman. In a fit of rage, he slit the customer's throat. After hiding the body, he abandoned the shop and fled. In 1785, Sweeney Todd decided to open a new barbershop on Fleet Street. He chose number 186, a grim, blackened building right next to St. Dunstan's Church. According to 19th century newspaper reports, the shop had a filthy storefront and windows covered in dust. A crooked sign hung over the door reading, "Sweeney Todd, Barber." Inside, 2 oil lamps barely lit the room. Wigs hung on the walls, like a row of severed heads. On the floor, around the massive oak chair, were dried, blackened bloodstains. Sweeney Todd was a pale, gloomy man with stiff red hair. He attracted customers with the promise of a shave for just 1 penny. But soon, people discovered that some customers paid a far more terrifying price. During the first few murders, Todd had not yet employed his famous revolving chair, the kind that could flip over and send the victim directly into an opening leading to the basement. According to reports in the British Daily Press, in the spring of 1785, a man who had come to London from the countryside. He stopped to watch the clock of St. Dunstan's Church. He struck up a conversation with a man dressed as a barber. An argument subsequently broke out between them. Without hesitation, the barber pulled out a razor and slit the man's throat. By the time the crowd realized what happened, the young man had already collapsed. The killer had vanished into an alley, just a few steps from the barbershop. Despite the solid evidence, Todd faced no consequences. He wasn't even questioned. Shortly thereafter, a shoemaker's apprentice went missing. The last time he was seen, he was heading to see Todd. Arabella Wilmot, the daughter of the master shoemaker, later recalled that her father offered a reward for clues, but there was never any news. Todd naturally denied everything. This murder marked the first time he profited from killing. As he took the tuition money the apprentice was meant to deliver to his master. Another victim was a grocer named Joseph Hansbury. Shortly after the barber visited his shop, Joseph was found dead, his throat slit. Authorities attributed it to insanity, a self-inflicted wound. No deep investigation was ever conducted. The same fate befell the merchant, Reuben Barney. His body was discovered in his own office. The killer had used a razor, once again, but the most brutal murder of this period was the killing of the petty swindler, Tony. When Tony's body was found, his skull was crushed, his throat slit, his spine snapped. Blood seeped from his mouth and ears, and his curled feet almost touched the back of his head. Yet no follow-up investigation was ever performed, as the victim had no relatives to seek justice for him. It is worth noting that London, in Sweeney Todd's era, London was a city where a killer could remain at large for years. This wasn't just due to the cunning of individual criminals, but lay in the very atmosphere of the British capital, which made crime a commonplace occurrence. The corrupt and inefficient justice system was more of a farce than a guarantee of social order. In 1785 alone, 97 people were executed, including a 9-year-old boy who broke a window and a father of 8 who stole a loaf of bread. Yet true culprits like Todd evaded justice for years. Police in the modern sense did not exist. Order was maintained by loosely organized bands of constables, who were more preoccupied with taking bribes than solving cases. Even when bodies were found with slit throats, law enforcement often blamed the victim's mental state, ruling it a suicide, simply to avoid dealing with troublesome cases. The overcrowded slums surrounding Fleet Street allowed criminals to vanish without a trace, into a labyrinth of courtyards and alleys. Alcohol and poverty made this picture even bleaker. Strong spirits were both a comfort to London's commoners, and their curse. Drunken brawls in taverns frequently resulted in deaths that no one bothered to investigate. In such a world, the death of a single person, whether a customer slit by a barber or a drunkard beaten with a club, aroused little interest from the authorities. In this London, Sweeney Todd and his kind could carry on their bloody work year after year. By the end of 1786, legends of a stone lion ghost began to circulate around Fleet Street, a mysterious killer who left behind strings of corpses. Todd might not have been the only criminal whose crimes spawned rumors, but his methods were a perfect fit for these urban legends. Soon he turned to a more sophisticated method of murder, the invention of that history-making revolving chair. And this idea, it likely originated from his visit to Mrs. Salmon's waxwork exhibition on Fleet Street. At the end of the 18th century, this was one of the main attractions on that street. It was an 18th century museum of horrors, filled with various mechanized exhibits designed to shock its visitors. By simply stepping on a hidden pedal, one of the wax figures would suddenly pounce toward the audience, while another would menacingly brandish a broom. To the average Londoner, this was merely an interesting pastime, but to Sweeney Todd, it was the prototype for a lethal trap. If a simple pedal mechanism could drive a waxwork, why couldn't a similar device be used on a barber's chair? Perhaps it was because of this, that the concept of the revolving chair was born. With just a sharp turn of a hidden lever, the customer, sitting for a shave, would vanish beneath the floor. Of course, there is another version of the story, that the idea was provided to Todd by a mechanic, whom Todd later murdered to keep the secret. The revolving chair consisted of 2 chairs fixed onto a square rotating platform. Hidden beneath the floor was a latch connected to a lever near the back door. When the barber triggered the lever, the latch would release, and the customer's weight would cause the platform to rotate. The customer would then fall into the basement, striking the hard stone floor below. Meanwhile, the second chair immediately swiveled into place, leaving no trace of the crime. Of course, not all victims of the mechanical chair died instantly. Some were still alive after falling into the basement, so Todd would go down shortly after and use his sharp razor to quickly slit their throats, finishing them off. Todd would then loot the bodies, taking any valuables, and move the corpses into the catacombs of St. Dunstan's Church. These underground tunnels, left behind from Roman-era London, were the ideal place to dispose of bodies. Evidence for this theory was discovered in the 1880s. At that time, near St. Dunstan's Church, while old buildings were being demolished, workers discovered a pit filled with bones beneath the building believed to be Todd's former barbershop. However, skeptics pointed out that St. Dunstan's Church had a considerable number of catacombs, and burials in the 18th century were often chaotic. Thus, the discovered bones might have belonged to ordinary citizens, and had nothing to do with Sweeney Todd at all. Furthermore, there is no mention of the mechanical chair in police archives. The device was only described in rumors and later literary works. If it truly existed, it would have made Todd one of London's most terrifying killers. The mechanical chair was only the beginning, and if the bodies were simply disposed of, it would be a bit of a waste. So, at this point, Mrs. Lovett and her bakery enter the scene. In a narrow alleyway in London, there was a small bakery, famous throughout all of London for its exceptionally delicious meat pies. Even high-ranking officials and nobles came specifically to taste this culinary miracle. None of them ever suspected that the secret to that unique flavor was the use of human flesh as the pie filling. This gruesome yet delicious bakery operated in tandem with Sweeney Todd's barbershop. After a customer getting a shave fell into the basement through the trapdoor, Todd would swiftly dismember the corpse, carving the meat from the bones. Other soft tissues, the heart, liver, and kidneys, were carefully placed into a crate, while the bones were taken to the crypts underneath St. Dunstan's Church to be piled among the rotting remains. As for the meat, it was sent directly into the bakery's basement via a secret tunnel, known only to Todd and Mrs. Lovett. There, Mrs. Lovett prepared those popular meat pies. She had helpers. But if a helper began to suspect the meat's source, then very soon they themselves would become the popular filling. Mrs. Lovett's own origins are shrouded in mystery. It is believed that her childhood and youth were spent in London, and her life's trajectory changed drastically during her teens. At that time, she married a baker named Joe Lovett, and together they ran a bakery in Holborn, England. But this marriage ended after Joe Lovett's mysterious death. After becoming a widow, Mrs. Lovett was involved with a law-breaking adventurer known as Major Barnett. When his fraudulent activities were exposed, Mrs. Lovett left him. For a time, she lived in Covent Garden, as the mistress of a wealthy merchant. Fate later led her to cross paths with Sweeney Todd. Their meeting took place when Sweeney Todd had already established himself on Fleet Street, and through his crimes had accumulated considerable wealth. An insatiable greed for riches drove Todd the barber to seek new opportunities. In Mrs. Lovett's calculating eyes, he saw a kindred soul. This alliance, built on mutual benefit and dark passions, soon evolved into one of the most terrifying criminal partnerships in London's history. Among the many horrific legends of Sweeney Todd, there is one that researchers consider to be the most credible story. It is the murder of Thomas Shadwell, an employee at St. Bartholomew's Hospital around 1798. It was a rainy autumn day. Thomas Shadwell was on his way to work on Fleet Street when he walked into the barber shop bearing the sign, Sweeney Todd, Barber. Usually he would have his beard shaved by another barber, but that day he chose this new place. Inside the barber shop, Todd had Thomas sit on a massive wooden chair in the center. Then, using the excuse of needing to buy fish, he sent his assistant out to get some. Immediately after, Todd activated the hidden mechanism of the chair. The chair flipped over, and Thomas plunged into the basement, striking the stone floor. Todd went down to the basement and slit his throat with a razor, then looted the body, taking a gold watch and money. What is it that makes this murder so special and credible? First, there is the written testimony of Thomas's son, who also worked at St. Bartholomew's Hospital.